My name is Marian Friedel, and I would love to introduce Sam Grant. He's the Executive Director of Minnesota 350. And Sam has been organizing around the intersection of economic, cultural, and environmental justice since his college days, working for divestment from South Africa and working to pass legislation ensuring workers and communities know about toxic chemicals in their workplaces and in where they're living. Sam brings decades of nonprofit leadership, transformative organizing, and love to his climate change work in Minnesota and the world. And he continues to work with Minnesota 350 for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, for a just transition that promotes a healthier future for all of us. Sam lives in the Twin City metro area, and we'd love for everyone to welcome Sam Grant to our monthly meeting.
Hey, welcome.
Yay.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you all. So it's my honor and pleasure to be here with you. I am going to do a quick screen share here. Let's see if I can get this thing to cooperate. Move that out of the way. There we go. So I want to talk with you all in Wisconsin today. So welcome to the people who live in the Madison area, and welcome to people who live in the Ashland area. And welcome to people who live in other areas of the great state of Wisconsin. I did live in Wisconsin for quite a few years. I had a little farm in Luck, Wisconsin, and was using it primarily as a retreat center to bring African Americans from the Twin Cities to have a rural experience, to get out on the land, to get out into the water, to sort of smell the fresh air. And I moved back to Minnesota to be closer to the day-to-day work that I'm doing in BIPOC communities, and then also easier access to get on an airplane when I was still flying quite frequently to do international work in Africa and the Caribbean. So I want to talk today about racial justice as climate justice. So in your own spirit, you don't have to say this out loud, but you can if you want to, just for fun. Say racial justice is climate justice. Racial justice is
climate justice.
Racial justice is climate justice.
Yes, it is. And yet here we are in the Midwest. And I think everybody on the call has probably got enough of an insight in history to know that there's a long narrative about the struggle for Black lives in this what's called the Deep South of the United States. But if you look at all of the data points for where African Americans and American Indians are actually facing the greatest hardships in terms of quality of life, it is right here in the Midwest. So I want to talk about Midwest apartheid. The worst place to live in the United States in a Black body is not in the Deep South. It's in the Midwest. And this region also has terrible disparities for indigenous peoples. So where I am in Minnesota, depending on your statistical variable, it's either African Americans or American Indians who are consistently faring the worst on all of the negative data points about quality of life, but then also faring the worst on all of the positive data points about quality of life in terms of not getting equitable benefits. So here's a map of the entire United States pointing out the regions with the worst racial disparities. And if you look right in the center of the map in the Midwest, you see that Wisconsin is number 1 in racial disparities. Minnesota is number 5 in racial disparities. The only state that's not in the Midwest that is in the top 5 is the state of Connecticut. So as we think about organizing in the Midwest for climate change, my question for us is, how do we organize for climate change with an awareness and a commitment to address the intersectionality of racial justice and climate justice? We can look at a number of variables, but one among many variables is look at income disparities. In 2017, where I live, the median household income for whites living in the Twin Cities was $82,000+ compared to $39,000+ for African American households. just 48% of white income. Think about all of the ways in which that 50% less of income impacts all of the choices you can make on a day-to-day basis and how your life today can set up your life tomorrow or not. So this is actually a really remarkable number since we're talking about this pattern in 2020. We should be at a point from now, 50, 60 years after the heyday of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where this is no longer the prevailing pattern. And yet here we are. And if we look at poverty, the poverty rate in the Twin Cities was 25.5% for African Americans, 5 times higher than that for whites. Among children under the age of 18, the child poverty rate was 8.5 times higher for Black children, at the rate of 33% in the Twin Cities, and only 3.9% for whites. The home ownership rate, only a quarter of African American residents own their homes, compared to nearly 80% of whites. So you take all of those things together, what we're talking about is ecological dynamics designed to reinforce racial inequality in the Midwest region. Many scholars are thinking about the intersectionality of racial inequality felt through the income, and then they're connecting it to racial inequality in terms of how it impacts our bodies and our longevity. Where I live in Minneapolis, if you live in North Minneapolis, just by virtue of being in that zip code, you live 11 years less on average than other folks. North Minneapolis has some of the worst environmental injustice disparities in the state of Minnesota in terms of higher asthma rates, higher obesity rates, higher diabetes rates, higher other forms of respiratory illness, and the list goes on. And part of that is because in North Minneapolis, where the African American community lives, is also where we have what we call the toxic corridor between the Mississippi River and Highway 94. So you add all of the toxic pollution coming off all of that traffic going up and down Highway 94, plus the chemicals spewed into the air, soil, and water from all those companies, you have a toxic, cocktail, leading to these environmental and health consequences, which reinforce or are reinforced by climate injustice and the climate crisis. And many different forms of disparities arise from that, in terms of allergy, respiratory illness, waterborne illness, heat island effects from the hot days we had during the summer, more impacts from existing historical trauma and root shock, exacerbating internalized racism and mental health problems, and the list goes on. We have the COVID crisis, and then in addition to the COVID crisis, we had the Memorial Day murder by police of George Floyd, who said very clearly that I can't breathe, and begged for his life and got no respect, did not have his dignity honored at all. The day this happened, because this incident happened, not far from where our office is for 350, our staff automatically mobilized and got out on the front lines in medical tents, providing care to people on the front line, but then also going back to the houses and preparing food to feed people who are out there on the front lines. For me, as I think about climate change and climate justice, I'd like us to think about 2 inhospitable climates that impact Black and brown bodies on Turtle Island. One is the long-standing pattern of colonialism and economic injustice and gender injustice and racial injustice, and the list goes on and on and on. And the second is how all of that is exacerbated by the climate crisis that we have now. For many, the climate crisis remains invisible and something that's going to impact us in the future, but in more and more communities of color around the United States and indigenous communities across the United States and Canada, people are already experiencing the negative impacts. The climate crisis is here right now in our day-to-day lives. So here's a picture of the COVID crisis. And I think many of you have already seen some of the data points. If you look at who is most impacted by this COVID crisis, it means very significantly, it's many of our elders who are living in senior care facilities. They're at high risk, and they have been among the most impacted. But in addition to our elders in senior care facilities, people who work on the front lines without sufficient PPE tend to be people brought in at the end of the health professions, career pathway. So they are the people who are the last hired and the first fired, which are largely people from BIPOC communities. So the number of healthcare workers from BIPOC communities who have been sickened and killed by the COVID crisis is significantly higher by race. The number of people locked into low-wage work across the United States impacted by this increasing unemployment are significantly racialized. So now you take the fact that we have this major months-long, by the time we're finished, more than a year-long COVID crisis, and you add that to the ways that the racial, injustice was already terribly dividing the fabric of society. And we have an election season, which is terribly dividing the fabric of society. And then you add to that the climate crisis. It's pretty wicked. So we have to be more wise than we've ever known how to be as human beings to face this moment in history with some pretty radical love for each other and radical love for the planet and massive creativity. So here's an image from the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Many people don't know about this, but the estimate from the national government in Haiti is that this earthquake actually killed 300,000 people. There hasn't been any other crisis in recent memory that's killed that many people outside of our wars. So this is massive in terms of its impact. And it was a major manifestation of the climate crisis, picking up from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and then followed by Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, which also caused massive damage. It killed far fewer people, but it massive damage, across that country. And as you think about the people living on coasts and people living on islands, all of these people are being forced by virtue of the climate behavior of people among elite nations in the world that are making it impossible for people to have lives on their original land. And they're having to come and say, knock on our door and say, hey, will you guys be hospitable to me? And what they're facing is a whole lot of xenophobia from those of us who are living in more privileged landscapes that are privileged at the expense of taking away the privilege of self-determination in other lands around the planet. But here is Hurricane Maria, which had devastating impacts in Puerto Rico. Official estimates of the death toll from this is around 6,000 people, but there's some dispute around the number of people actually killed. But if you think about this small island nation and the fact that the hurricane took out 300 million trees, well, what is the impact of losing 300 million trees on the climate system? It's pretty massive. And so what's going to be the future of this island since that massive, mature, more forest ecosystem is no longer there? These are questions we have to grapple with. I'm very proud to say MN350 is actually doing an agroecology project with Puerto Rico to think about how we do agroecological resilience on the island. So if we think about mapping the impacts of climate change, just look at the area in darker colors on this map. The darker colors on this map indicate regions of the world that contributed the least to the problem but are facing the worst impacts. Outside of my work at MN350, I am also doing work across the entire African diaspora on how people of the African diaspora are being impacted by climate change and how people are organizing to address climate change. And I'll have some stuff that's published that comes out on that sometime next year. Sarra Tekola, who is a Black Lives Matter activist, said something that I think is really worth remarking on given the moment we're in right now. She said, when you think about a cop shooting you, it's an immediate death. But climate change with related pollution that's mostly in our backyard is still killing us. Respiratory diseases, asthma, and various cancers are slower killers, but connecting them to Black lives is really important. So as you all think about this intersectionality, I think it's important just to begin to sort of draw a little map in the center of a page of paper. And in the center of that, circle, right, racial justice is climate justice. And then begin to think about whether you're in Ashland or Madison or another area of Wisconsin, what are all of the ways we're seeing that intersection manifest itself through the cost of utility bills, through health disparities, through educational disparities, through income disparities, through wealth disparities, and the list goes on and on and on. Elizabeth Yeampierre, who leads the Climate Justice Alliance, said, "I think about people who got the worst food, the worst health care, the worst treatment, and then when freed, were given lands that were eventually surrounded by things like petrochemical industries." So what she's talking about here is if you go all the way back to the 17th century, the people who were displaced from their lands, our original indigenous inhabitants, and then the people who were brought here in debt, peonage, labor, or brought here as slaves, have been forced to live in the most marginal habitat of this country, which is most impacted by climate change, but is also more likely than other places in the country to have the environmental injustice overburden of waste dumps and also companies that are spewing, harsh chemicals into the air, soil, and water. Climate change, race, and health are fundamentally related to each other. Many of us live in areas that are particularly vulnerable, like communities on the coast. We're coping with higher levels of existing health risks when compared to other groups. We live in low-income communities with limited access to healthcare services. We have higher rates of uninsured individuals who have difficulty accessing quality healthcare. We have limited availability of information and resources in our native languages, and we have less ability to relocate and rebuild after a disaster because of disparities in the determination of who has access to insurance and who has access to sufficient income and wealth to make their boat float in a self-determined way in our economy. So we're in the midst of an escalating crisis. Climate change is exacerbating many different forms of racial injustice. Disease by water contamination, heat island effects, access to healthy food, mental health through historical trauma and root shock, as I mentioned earlier, and then the amplifying of pre-existing conditions like asthma, diabetes, and COPD, and heart disease. So here's the Midwest. This is where we are. And I'm speaking about the Midwest as a whole because I'm excited to share, in partnership with 350.org, MN350 is hiring a Midwest regional organizer who is going to start on November 2nd. And her task is to help us work collectively across the entire Midwest and define a collective action framework to address climate change and racial justice at Midwest scale. So it's an exciting opportunity, and our dialogue tonight is sort of like a way to sort of begin that relationship, and that organizer will be looking for opportunities to work with you all in Wisconsin relatively soon, less than a month from now. So I don't know how many of you have read the excellent work on civil resistance by Chenoweth and Stephan, but it's a really important book, and what it says is the good news. If we get 3.5% of the people highly activated, that highly activated base throughout the last more than 100 years has been enough of a force consistently in all of the cases they looked at to foster massive transformation. So we have to think about how many people in the Midwest do we need to organize to have that massive transformation about the intersection of climate justice and racial justice. So given the size of the population, that is 2.4 million people that we have to get sustainably activated. Now, that might seem like a tall number and a tall order, but I'd like us to recognize just how profoundly serious and urgent the climate crisis is, and to just sort of collectively acknowledge there's really not a plan B here because there's not a planet B somewhere else. So we, Earthlings, have to figure this out in time to avert massive climate catastrophe for a lot of people, here on the Earth. And again, that catastrophe will not be evenly shared, which is a tremendously violent form of injustice. We can do a lot to prevent the worst forms of that injustice by taking action comprehensively in the next 10 years. So how do we do it? We have to take racial justice action. We have to take climate justice action. We have to take gender justice action. We have to take economic justice action. And we have to recognize that all of that action is connected. That all of this work is part of one work. It's not work that should be dividing us. It's work that should be bringing us together. We've had many, many years of struggle where we are isolated from each other and working in fragments. We need to have the climate justice movement actually be a connective movement where we stop living in silos and we start really learning how to partner with each other. So how are we doing this work at MN350? one thing that we began to do when the COVID crisis hit, and then exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd, is to put racial justice embodied in all of our campaigns. We upgraded our staff to majority BIPOC, and that happened relatively quick. We were a little bit less than that when I came in, and now we are more than 50% BIPOC. Our board is now about 42% BIPOC, and I'm bringing on a couple of new board members in early 2021, and then that number will sort of flip to majority BIPOC. We organized a BIPOC caucus in 2019, which played a key role in the hiring process that brought me on as the new executive director at MN350. And that BIPOC caucus is now working very closely with me on monitoring how uneven dynamics are impacting BIPOC communities across the state of Minnesota around this election, and then also helping me put together a long-term strategy so that as we look at our membership and volunteer base, which is about 36,000 people in Minnesota, we actually want that number of our base to grow to about 75,000 people within the next 2 years. And we want 25 to 30% of that expanded base to be from BIPOC communities. To be intentional about that, we're really thinking about how do we honor the people from these diverse communities that are living in all of the pockets of Minnesota right now. So we've done a demographic analysis of who's living in our 6 organizing regions: Northwest and Northeast Minnesota, Southwest and Southeast Minnesota, the central part of Minnesota surrounding the metro area, and then the metro area. So we're designing region-specific organizing strategies in each of those areas of the state to mobilize a base. And we're thinking about what is the connection point between what we want to do to realize the intersection of climate justice and racial justice and the just transition strategy that makes sense and is most relevant for people in that region. So some highlights in terms of this work. And this is actually my last slide, and we can move on to questions after this, is to think about honoring treaty rights, and to think about land justice, and to think about just transitions organizing. The Attorney General in Minnesota put a lawsuit together against Koch Industries, against American Petroleum Institute, and against ExxonMobil. And there's people who have attacked him for that and said it was a frivolous lawsuit. But what he's saying is pretty clearly that those companies knew what they were doing was causing egregious harm to the environment and to people, and they kept doing it anyway. So it was a consumer protection lawsuit angle that he used. And I applauded him for that. And as we work with the governor in the state of Minnesota to ensure that we continued the appeal on line 3 to continue to block that line from being built, sending oil through Minnesota to benefit one major petrochemical company, but not really help us address climate change. The governor got a lot of heat from people saying this is a job killer. And so as I think about just transition organizing, what I'm really trying to push us to define very clearly is how there's a better future in the short term and in the longer term for people currently engaged in fossil fuels. I want those people to be on the front line of our side saying, I see the future, and the future is not in oil, the future is not in gas, the future is not in coal. So we want to join with all of you in the demand to leave the gas in the grass, the coal in the hole, and the oil in the soil. And we really want to have a renewable energy society, and we want to be full partners in that exciting future. As we do that work with people in fossil fuels, we also want to think about the historic pattern of who has access to land. In Minnesota, there's more than 110,000 white farmers, and there's, I think, about 1,300 farmers of color in the entire state who are farming on about 1.4% of all the agricultural land in the state. So part of our work is to realize, the demography of Minnesota is changing. We need to make our rural communities more hospitable to all of our cultures. And as we do that, grow local living economies in those cultures that honor production from BIPOC farmers. So we're launching an initiative. We was slowly launched. We already, kind of began it with one site in Southeast Minnesota, but we're doing a launch meeting on Wednesday for something called the Agrarian Commons, where we're really trying to engage a number of BIPOC and emerging farmers in partnering with us around 4 linked objectives. Demonstrate how much carbon you can sequester in your growing practices in the soil. Demonstrate how much biodiversity you can bring back by the way you grow food. Contribute to a local living economy with what you grow on your farm. And partner with the other farmers to increase a cooperative future for people who are living in a way that honors the earth, honors all people, and creates a healthy future. And finally, we're working very intentionally to honor treaty rights in the way we work. So we do a coexistence statement or a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings. And we invite people to entertain the question, like you all did in your breakout, how is our work right now honoring treaty rights or reinforcing the violation of those treaty rights? And what can we do from today forward to better honor treaty rights in the way we do our work? So one of our projects that I'm really excited about is in northern Minnesota, and we're working to do a scenario planning process that brings the city of Bemidji together and Beltrami County together with the 3 Native nations that are close to the city of Bemidji. So that's the White Earth Nation, the Leech Lake Nation, and the Red Lake Nation. And all of them are working together in a number of scenario planning sessions to put together a set of scenarios for what the future might look like between now and 2050. And then we'll publish our final report and submit that to the Consortium on Scenario Planning and the Lincoln Institute, who are our partners in this work, next May. So those are some of the exciting things that we're doing, but I will stop my presentation here and entertain some questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Sam. That was really great. Thank you. So anybody that has a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll get started with a few questions right now. Can you just say a little bit about the provocative statement at the beginning of your talk about the Midwest and comparing it to the Deep South, and just give us a little context for that, or how to think about that? And yeah.
There are a lot of different ways you could measure racial hospitality. But the people who are using the measures that were represented in the slides that I showed are looking at very specific quality of life indicators. So that's based on a composite index of home ownership rates, health disparities, educational disparities, income, and wealth. And so based on those variables, it is 4 states in the Midwest that are consistently proving worst in terms of quality of life.
Well, thank you. Seth wants to know, ever since Van Jones published The Green Collar Economy, the idea of improving the economy and the environment at the same time has been gathering steam, most recently with the youth-driven calls for the Green New Deal. How do you see this helping or hurting communities of color?
It's an important question, Seth. Thanks for asking. And I appreciate the work that was announced at the beginning of your work with others in terms of the Stop the Money pipeline. We have a lot of banks that not only have benefited tremendously from climate harm, they've also benefited tremendously from racial harm. And so I think as we look at the Green New Deal or any strategies to live and organize at the intersection of environmental quality and job quality, I think it's fair to say that we have a lot of work to do. When the governor of Minnesota decided to refile the appeal on line 3, he got messages from 40 mayors in small cities that are along the route of the pipeline saying this is going to bring several thousand jobs to our region. You have to do the right thing, which is to build this pipeline and knock out the resistance. And the governor is somebody who really appreciates the science, and the science was really clear. You can't do this. This is going to be so bad for climate. We really can't do this. And Minnesota is also one of the leaders in the country in terms of producing jobs in the renewable energy space. One of the challenges is increasing the number of people from BIPOC communities that are benefiting from opportunities in the renewable energy economy. That's an area of growth. That's an edge that I want to say. We're not doing as well as we need to do, Seth, in making sure that our career and opportunity pipelines are equitable. If an African-American or an American Indian entrepreneur wants to launch a business in the renewable energy space, they face much greater impediments to getting in the door or growing from a sole proprietorship business to a business that can actually hire a lot of talent. and be a significant contributor to the regional economy. We're proud to say that MN350 has been actively partnering with some of our emerging entrepreneurs from communities of color. And we have been in dialogue and in support of 2 African-American entrepreneurs who are bringing renewable energy enterprises, into existence, and then also an American Indian entrepreneur who is working across the whole state of Minnesota in both the urban and the rural spaces. But it's significantly uphill work. And so I think it's important for each one of you to go back to your financial institution and say, how are you supporting businesses from our American Indian communities and communities of color? I want to know what your track record is. I think it's important for you to go to your workforce development centers and ask them, what's your track record? What's your batting average on helping people from disadvantaged communities get jobs in the renewable energy space and the renewable society infrastructure that we're all dreaming is necessary to bring alive sooner rather than later? Go to the Chamber of Commerce and say, how many businesses of color and American Indian businesses are part of your network? And how are you intentional about making sure you do your part to make sure that mutual prosperity includes and in fact centers, those people who've been significantly marginalized by the way we think about economic opportunity up to now. So Seth, I love your question. And those are just a few insights I'd offer as things to sort of mark on the landscape of organizing in Wisconsin.
Thank you. So I've had several questions kind of along this line. So Emily would like to know if you have seen other environmental organizations have success bringing BIPOC activists in heavily white communities like Madison, where BIPOC people might feel their time is better used in movements focused exclusively on racial issues. Also, in majority white groups like ours, how do we talk to members who think that racial justice is a problem that can be delayed until after the climate crisis is solved? I think your talk sort of lent itself to that, but yeah.
Yeah, so just the question of delay. I think this is a well-worn mantra. Justice delayed is justice denied. So I know that there's many people who you will talk to who get how urgent the climate crisis is. And you might notice in your own spirit, it's not easy for you to lovingly interrogate that proposition made by a person you're in dialogue with. You might have some internal resistance of your own. So I want you to be on your own journey and just continue to recite the mantra, racial justice is climate justice. We cannot secure substantive climate change without addressing the long history of racial justice and colonialism on Turtle Island. We have to. And then take feedback as people tell you why they don't think that's true. Listen really, really well with love in your heart. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of our recent ancestors, I think said this really, really well. And she said, you can't get the other side to pay attention if you break them down for believing something that you disagree with. You have to attract them to a perspective that's bigger and broader and more connective than theirs with love. So you have to speak to them from a place of love. You have to listen to them from underneath their perspective and hold them with loving regard there and support them in finding their own pathway to that halfway point between where they were and where you are. And that space is a growing space for both of you that allows us to transcend polarization and turn it into broader, beloved community, which is what Martin Luther King Jr. was always trying to do with his work, and other nonviolent peace activists have been doing throughout all of human history. So some people believe we can have a technocratic solution to climate change. In indigenous communities and BIPOC communities all over the planet, we call those false solutions. Because as we look at the way that you might go about realizing those solutions, what they do is actually increase racial inequality, increase the displacement of people from indigenous and peasant communities from their land. So it actually is further eroding quality of life, not adding to quality of life. So we can't just have technocratic or market solutions to these problems. We have to have a solution to these problems that's based on a deeper expression of our most deeply held human values. The most deeply held human values that I want to encourage us to consider organizing on the basis of is care for the earth, care for each other, and mutual care for the future. Care for the earth, care for each other, and mutual care for the future, which means I don't think any of you want to live in a world where you're excluded, where you're disrespected, where you're stepped on for somebody else to have access to well-being. And since you don't want that world, it's incumbent on you to say you don't want that world for anybody else either. So we have to work together to co-create that world, because we're still a far way away from it, but it's a world that's possible and necessary, and it will come through the daily practice of love and co-evolution. So I want us to trust that all we can do as relatives is stay in the process that our deepest spirit calls us to, and to communicate that as broadly as we can to as many people as possible. And what I'm noticing is that more and more people are joining with that ripple ecology, appreciating that welcome and doing their part and inviting more people into the movement with us. So that's what I'll say. I appreciate the tough question. And it's a question that is a struggle for a lot of folks. So just to get to the brass tacks, if I'm in a BIPOC body, should I be organizing in a white space? It depends. We all are earthlings after all, aren't we? So should it be the norm that I can talk to any of you with love and you'll receive me with love? Shouldn't that be the norm? It should. But there are certain places where there's a lot of inhospitality and a lot of hostility, where it's not safe for me to go and try and talk to people. So one thing that we're saying in BIPOC communities is we really want to have a new dialogue that transcends the discourse that traps us around race. We need a discourse around radical humanism, of really learning to love and work with each other from the deepest place as human beings and as spiritual beings. As Teilhard de Chardin said, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Wouldn't it be nice if we lived as though that was true? That'd be delightful. So I would invite us to give ourselves that world right now and share it, and then more people will start to come.
That's such a great place to end. Thank you so much, Sam. We really appreciate that you're here. We're very excited about this Midwest organizer that you're talking about. We'll be looking for that. We'll be working to become very involved with that too. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your questions. And we really appreciate your being here.
My pleasure. Thank you all. And many blessings, and I'll stay in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you.